I have the honor of calling this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 15, Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I am joining you today from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Chinantan nations. Pursuant to the order of reference of April 20th, 2020, the committee is meeting for the purpose of receiving evidence concerning matters related to the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Today's meeting is taking place by video conference, and the proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. During this meeting, the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. In order to facilitate the work of our interpreters and ensure an orderly meeting, I'd like to outline a few rules to follow. Interpretation in this video conference will work very much like a regular committee meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. In order to resolve the sound issues raised in recent virtual committee meetings and ensure clear audio transmission, we ask those who wish to speak during the meetings to set your interpretation language as follows. If speaking in English, please ensure you are on the English channel. If speaking in French, please ensure that you are on the French channel. As you are speaking, if you plan to alternate from one language to the other, you'll need also to switch the interpretation channel so it aligns with the language that you are speaking. You may want to allow for a short pause when switching languages. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When you are ready to speak, you can either click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, or you can hold down the space bar while you are speaking, and when you release the bar, the mic will mute itself just like a walkie-talkie. A reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair. Should members need to request the floor outside of their designated time for questions, state that they have a point of order. If a member wishes to intervene on a point of order that has been raised by another member, they should use the raise hand function. This will signal the chair your interest to speak, and in order to do so, you should click on participants at the bottom of the screen, and when the list pops up, you will see next to your name that you can click raise hand. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. When you're not speaking, your mic should be mute. The use of headphones is strongly encouraged. If you have earbuds with a microphone, please hold the microphone near your mouth when you're speaking to boost the sound quality for our interpreters. Should any technical challenges arise, for example, in relation to interpretation, or if you accidentally are disconnected, please advise the chair or the clerk immediately, and the technical team will work to resolve them. And please note that we may need to suspend during these times, as we need to ensure all members are able to participate fully. Before we get started, can everyone click on their screen in the top right-hand corner and ensure they are on gallery view? With this view, you should be able to see all the participants in a grid view and will ensure that all video participants can see one another. During this meeting, we'll follow the same rules that usually apply to opening statements and the rounds for questioning of witnesses during our regular meetings. Each witness will have up to 5 minutes for an opening statement, followed by the usual rounds of questions from members. And so now, let me introduce our witnesses. Representing their views as individuals, we have Eric Cardinal and Ellen Gabriel. From the Kativik Ilisarniliranik, I hope I got that right, Robert Watt is president. And from the Sheridan College, Elijah Williams, Director of Indigenous Engagement for the Center for Indigenous Learning and Support. So, Mr. Cardinal, you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you for inviting me to present before this committee. Your work is very important. Now, when I look at how the management of the COVID-19 crisis is being experienced in Indigenous communities, one thing strikes me. It's the marked difference between the measures taken or desired by Indigenous leaders and those adopted by non-Indigenous communities. This divide is particularly evident in regions where we have seen Indigenous communities adopt much stricter measures more quickly than their non-Aboriginal neighbors. For example, most First Nations in Quebec quickly closed their communities to prevent the virus from entering them. We have also seen First Nations maintain the closure of certain services and institutions while the province decreed that they be opened. Why this distinction then? First of all, for health reasons. Because Indigenous populations, as you know, present higher risk factors than others for COVID-19 due to their particular health distinction between what the Indigenous populations and the non-Indigenous populations are doing. So the issue of health, obviously, and also Indigenous communities have much higher occupancy rates per dwelling than the non-Indigenous populations, making it even more difficult to comply with the social distancing measures. And it must be remembered that the First Nations have been particularly marked by past epidemics, which resulted in traumas, both psychological and cultural, that still persist today. Also, and this is the focus of my presentation today, in Indigenous communities, that's based on the right to self-government, a concept whose recognition is being challenged in this period of pandemic. This crisis particularly highlights the difficulty for governments to recognize the status of governments to entities otherwise known as band councils. To illustrate this, I will use three examples of First Nations in Quebec. The first example is the one that has received the most media coverage in recent weeks. It concerns the issue of the reopening of Oka Park, a park under the responsibility of the government of Quebec, but located on the unceded territory of the Mohawk Nation, and whose opening was decreed without any consultation with the authorities of the Mohawk Council of Kanasatake. This example they came up with improvised roadblocks. This was during the Patriots Feast, and there was a conflict that ensued between the Mohawk Council and the provincial government, forcing the federal government to intervene. This example shows that government officials don't have the reflex of consulting First Nations leaders when they take decisions concerning these so-called non-unceded territories, and most of Quebec territory is under this. So the absence of consultation is seen even if there is a territorial negotiation ongoing, as we see in the Oka region with the Mohawks. The two other examples that were less mediatized, despite efforts made, they show to what point government services are always caught up in this colonial Indian Act. I can give the example of the Long Point in Abitibi. They decreed the shutting of their community and tried to impose strict travel restrictions on their members. Without any police force, it called upon the services of the Sûreté du Québec, which is the provincial police, regular police patrolling, but they say they do not have the authority to enforce the First Nations measures. Why? Because the community located in the village of Winaway is not officially a reserve within the meaning of the Indian Act. Therefore, even if it is recognized that since at least the report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People in 1996, that self-government is an inherent Aboriginal right protected under Section 35 of the Constitutional Act of 1982, and even though the federal government theoretically recognizes the councils as First Nations governments, we are still a long way from this recognition. For the third example, we move to Gaspésie Peninsula.
Onto those points, and I'm sure they'll come up again so that you can complete later on in our panel. Right now,
écoutez, je vais sauter mon troisième.
Well, I will. Gaspeg is not really a reserve, so they don't have any government emergency assistance, which is offered to all the First Nations. I just wanted to point out that before the COVID-19 crisis and that which the rail crisis that preceded it, the federal government had started some reconciliation. We should make sure that these crises do not cause a backsliding in relationship between the federal government and the First Nations.
Sir, we understand. That's fine, and I don't want to lose any of the testimony you wish to present, but in order to keep the meeting organized, we go by our time limits on speakers and questions. And so, but I'm sure that if we don't hear further testimony that you wish to have, that it can be sent to us via letter so that we don't miss anything. Right now, I'd like to call on Mr. Robert Watt, the president of the Kativik Ilisarnilirinik. Sir, how close did I come?
Not too close.
Sorry. 5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
My name is Robert Watt. I'm the president of Kativik Ilisarnilirinik, the school board of Nunavik. I would first like to thank you for inviting me. I'm really glad to have the opportunity of informing you about how the Nunavik education sector has been affected by COVID-19 pandemic. As you are aware, the school year ended March 23rd in Nunavik, and now we are planning to reopen school in August, and to the health and safety measures announced for Nunavik as our communities open slowly. These unprecedented times have highlighted key needs in education, and I would like to focus on 6 recommendations that are essential for education in Nunavik. I filed a briefing document with the committee where you will find comprehensive background on each of these recommendations, and I encourage you to read it. Recommendation number 1, telecommunication infrastructures. Without access to broadband/high-speed internet, there is no real prospect for distance education and online education platforms to develop as a serious service offering in the youth, adult, and post-secondary sectors in Nunavik. Access to technology. In Nunavik, a region where the cost of living is particularly high, the 2018 median income of Inuit families was of 25,627 compared to 61,400 for the rest of Canada. So families and students must be provided the financial means to acquire. This is essential to ensure as learning is likely to increasingly shift towards online platforms and tools. Testing as we proceed with the reopening of our schools and adult education centers, and in order to transportation networks and institutions, it will be important for the Nunavik organizations and air carriers servicing our communities to have access to COVID-19 testing with reduced delays for obtaining results. On the backdrop of a high tuberculosis rate and a recent history of devastating epidemics, this is key to addressing the fear and anxiety many Nunavik feel about the prospect of reopening our communities. Water and sewers services, access to water and sewer services remain an ongoing issue in Nunavik. Lack of water or sewage service is a recurring cause of school closure in most of our communities. In the context of COVID-19, where the main health measure is to wash our hands frequently, we need to see infrastructure investments that will support and ensure sustainable maintenance of our water, sewer services beyond this pandemic. Continuously growing student population and a renewed interest for post-secondary studies at a distance, we need to see infrastructure investments that will support the Nunavik education system beyond the immediate measures announced in the context of this pandemic. This includes school and adult education centers, construction, renovation, expansion, housing for employees, student residences in the adult sector, and study space for post-secondary students. And lastly, and not least, is on the land education and Inuktitut language protection. The educational resources, digital content, online platforms, and curriculum developed by the school board are available in Inuktitut, English, and French. We need to recognize that guaranteeing consistent access to content in Inuktitut that has been developed from an Inuit perspective requires additional time, specific expertise, and can only happen adequate funding. On the land, education programs and activities offer unique educational opportunities that connect youth to their language, identity, and communities. They play a critical role in strengthening the Inuktitut language and require adequate funding. At the school board, on the land education and educational excursions have benefited from the support of New Paths for Education, a program formerly administered under Indigenous and Northern Affairs. Discussions on the transfer of funding available through this program to the province of Quebec are currently occurring. This means that federal funding the school board currently relies on for on-the-land education could be distributed through the of Education of Quebec. We would like to stress the utmost importance of ensuring a seamless transition of this program, as a gap in accessing to funding could jeopardize some of the culturally relevant activities offered by our schools. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And unfortunately, some of your presentation was not captured because of the internet connection. So, oops, I'll do that. So, but you did say at the beginning that the points were, we have those 6 points that you made. Hopefully, along the way, we'll be able to solve the internet connections. But we'll continue on now, and hopefully, Ms. Gabriel, if you're all ready to go, we'll see how your 5 minutes of testimony works out technically. So please go ahead, and then we'll, Mr. Pawlowski, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, kind of a point of order. So far in this committee, we're yet to see this. It's fantastic. I think we're getting translation from Inuktitut into English. Is that not remarkable? I think that's fantastic. But is this something that's always available?
Madam Clerk.
The witness was speaking English, but we do offer third language interpretation with advance notice.
Oh, well, they were totally non-lined up, so I figured that we were getting a translation because speaking the voice was going in a totally different. So sorry about that.
Okay, so that's because of the connection, which is slow. Ms. Gabriel, can you go ahead now for 5 minutes?
Yeah. Good to all the parliamentary committee members. Like many people around the world, when the pandemic began, who felt like we were walking through a dystopic world in a blindfold, there was no leadership in the community for at least a month. We were vulnerable to outside community members coming in to buy marijuana or cigarettes, and it took a while for the emergency response unit to actually declare a pandemic on March 23rd. My apologies to the translators. I realize I have 5 minutes and not enough time. The fact that the businesses in Kanesatake and in Kahnawake have been vilified and ostracized by colonial entities made it more problematic, and we felt even more vulnerable at the start of this pandemic. As you may know, we live in a community that has 3 centuries of fighting for our rights to our homelands being ignored. And when you have no rights in a pandemic, this does not improve the situation of fear or uncertainty and of more land dispossession. This problematic perspective, of course, is rooted in institutionalized and societal racism, which devalues Indigenous peoples' lives, which have been subjugated by colonizations and its impacts. As the declaration of a pandemic was declared by Prime Minister Trudeau, Indigenous peoples were still in the throes of the Wet'suwet'en protests, anti-pipeline protests, Indigenous rights, and the pandemic suppressed this movement. And we understand why, because of the health precautions. The construction workers and police remained occupied on Wet'suwet'en lands, and they continued in spite of an MOU with the traditional hereditary chiefs. And so in Kanesatake, we were trying to deal with economics before rights. We have an elders home that was shut down when the pandemic was declared, so we have no cases there. I should clarify that the community I come from, Kanesatake, was also the Oka crisis, and I heard one of the previous speakers mentioned Oka Park, and that's where I'm coming from. There was a meeting that was made up mostly of local Mohawks stay home in COVID-19. Nobody knew about this, in spite of people like Teresa Tams telling everybody to stay home. But even so, even in spite of my hesitancy, I do agree with the checkpoints that were put up. There is a preconceived notion, and we are a community villainized by the media and the government. And there remains a fallacy that we are lawless. And so public attitudes dictate that no laws apply to our community even during a pandemic. So we had youth from spring break coming to our community as if this was their playground. The pandemic has caused us to be more vulnerable inside our checkpoints. Many human rights abuses were committed and harassed. The people at the checkpoints were harassed even by the SQ, by a doctor and the mayor of Oka. And these are outlined in my written submission. And as Indigenous people, we are shut out and silenced by the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Relations, Carolyn Bennett. She silences the voices of the traditional government. This is too big an issue to discuss at this parliamentary committee, but on a daily basis, we feel vulnerable, especially when land dispossession is continuing because construction has been allowed while everybody is told to stay home and self-isolate. We do not have a voice, and I think it's safe to say that we suffer from chronic fatigue of institutionalized racism. As Indigenous peoples, we have been made to feel as we are dispensable throughout our lives by a settler society that has not come to the realization that our rights are human rights. We are peoples with the right to self-determination, but Canada still exerts colonial oppression, stalling any progress that could be made if they upheld the various international human rights norms that they are signatories to. Instead, we are placated with engagement sessions that benefit the colonizers' dispossession of our inherent rights. This year on July 11th in 2020 marks the 30th anniversary of the siege of Ganasadaga and Ganawage, which you know as the Oka Crisis. It is a time of awakening and a 3 centuries long dispute by Ganyakahaga of Ganasadaga. The Rudinuseshaga people have been excluded. As we witness in the US and the international outrage of Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd, we see once again the heavy toll that institutionalized racism has taken. Canada has had plenty of opportunities to make the sorely needed changes now. It's time for reconciliation and reparations, pandemic or not. Economic self-interest has been the root of colonization, the free market capitalist and the global economy. As the first peoples of Turtle Island, we are never given the respect for our rights on a daily basis, and more so in a pandemic. And in the protests and the blockades will continue. The teachings of our ancestors tell us that there can be no peace in an atmosphere of fear. There can be no justice when we fight every day for the respect of our fundamental human rights. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you. And I'm sure, I know that our time seems limited, but over the next hour and several minutes, I'm sure you'll be able to expand on some of your points. As we move now for our final speaker, the Director of Indigenous Engagement for the Center for Indigenous Learning and Support, Sheridan College, Elijah Williams. Mr. Williams, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Witnesses and honorable members, I'm honored to be here with you virtually, and I am speaking from Oakville, which is on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Wendat people, and my own people, the Haudenosaunee. I'll be speaking about a snapshot of what I heard from Indigenous learners in the face of COVID-19 in post-secondary. So COVID-19 has brought out many unprecedented challenges that nobody expected. Post-secondary education was no exception to the pandemic. Students and many of our Indigenous learners had to adjust to a new way of learning through a virtual experience. In my work as Director of Indigenous Engagement, we heard from many students regarding this change. Many felt they had a hard time adjusting. There were students who had no access to proper internet services on reserve, and in some cases had to drive to a nearby town or Tim Hortons parking lot to conduct their studies to access Wi-Fi. School is already stressful as it is, but when this happened, it added a new layer of stress. Students did not have access to spaces on campus anymore where they would normally conduct their studies or have access to Indigenous centers for cultural support. We heard a lot about technology as being an issue for students. A lot of people don't have access to computers or have their own computers, so access to campuses are a huge priority. So at Sheridan, we provided a laptop loan program to students in critical need. It is easy for us who live outside of a reserve community or rural area to immediately switch to remote work and learning. But for many of our students and people, this was not the case. Many were out of work. Many could not access those important support services that they require without having to go in person. So when I bring up the post-secondary student support program, which is the main program that administers band funding, and each band has a different way of interpreting the national policy on this. And we heard from many students who had a difficult time receiving support from their band, as many were living far away from their community. Some students are required to have attendance sheets because of the immense administrative burden the program places on students and staff. And I also want to bring up the follow-up paperwork that needs to be submitted. Despite COVID-19 and despite everyone having to adjust to a new way of working and learning, the deadlines to submit your follow-up paperwork submissions did not change because of COVID-19. And in fact, it stayed with the status quo. I know in my own community of 6 Nations of the Grand River, a lot of people still had to follow the same deadlines. And if they didn't have internet or a computer to apply online for a May 1st deadline, they were not eligible. So when I bring this up, I really hope that people can understand that this program really needs to be nimble. The information regarding supports for Indigenous learners was not clear, and there was no update or guidelines on students who are being funded through their bands. In my belief, stronger communication between government, organization, and post-secondary institutions will ensure students are being supported as best they can because we at the school have direct contact with many of our learners. The funding formulas for this program should be examined as many as there's more students applying to post-secondary. And as the country reopens, many will need to reskill and potentially go back to school. I also heard from 2 different students from different communities up north in Northern Ontario, where they were not allowed to go back to the community because of access restrictions. They had to remain living off the reserve because of that. In my view, it appears that Indigenous learners and people are in the gray area when it comes to post-secondary, as it's mainly a provincial responsibility. However, I know our federal government has a duty to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis as well. So before I end, I also want to share some exciting news with all of you. So despite the challenges of COVID-19, we did have 51 Indigenous learners graduate from Sheridan this term. So I'm very proud of all those students, and thank you, Yawa, merci.
Well, thank you very much. What a good note to conclude your presentation on, although there's more to come, because now we go to rounds of questions. And our first round is 6 minutes each. And I have on my list the speakers will be Mr. Viersen, Ms. Damoff, Ms. Perube, Ms. Arnold, you're up for 6.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for our witnesses for being here today. I want to go to Mr. Cardinal first. He was cut off early with his comments, something about the Gaspé, and I was just wondering if you could outline that particular scenario and just finish his comments around that. Mr. Cardinal?
Yes, that's quite nice of you. My third example was in Gaspésie, the Mi'kmaq Nation, which is really not a reserve. The members live mostly on the unceded traditional territories in the Gaspé region, but they don't really have a community to manage. They should be seen as other First Nations governments. So they asked for the SERP program. They received nothing, just $150,000. That wasn't much. They said Gaspé doesn't have a right to this assistance because they are not considered a reserve. Since the start of the crisis, the council is trying to fulfill its responsibilities towards the members, and Gaspé just wants assistance for some of the additional costs associated to the crisis management brought about by the COVID-19. And what we see, the answer is basically the First Nations are being told that they cannot receive any money because they do not correspond to the criteria dictated by a colonialist view of First Nations management. We are in government-to-government relationship that the Canadian government says it wants to maintain. So that was the third example I was trying to come up with to show some of the difficulties in reconciling the recognition of the First Nations governments with the COVID-19 crisis management.
Thank you, Mr. Cardinal. Mr. Chair, I'd like to just move a notice of motion right now. I was going to do that right at the beginning of my comments. I'll do that right now. Pursuant to the Standing Order 1082, that the committee undertake a comprehensive study of the Indian Act as an outdated colonial structure and the Act's quality, violence, and injustice and poverty experienced by First Nations, and that the scope of the study include but not be limited to the discussion of the abolition of the Indian Act, the fiduciary responsibilities of the federal crown, and to improve living conditions on First Nations, community safety, and criminal justice reform, and that the witness list include ministers, the department officials, band councils, band members, individuals, and community groups, and that all meetings for this study be televised, and that the committee report its findings and recommendations with concrete steps to the government that can take to the House, and that pursuant to Standing Order 109, the committee requests that the government table a comprehensive response to this report.
That is your notice of motion. You have about 3 minutes left in your question.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to turn to Ms. Gabrielle. In her comments, she talked about how it seemed difficult to enforce lockdown measures around her community. That's totally different than where the experience up in Northern Alberta. In Northern Alberta, typically most communities have maybe 2 or 3 routes in, and most of them were barricaded with folks monitoring the entrances and exits to the First Nation communities. Was that attempted in your case, in your community, and is that totally unfeasible given the location of your community?
Well, after 3 centuries of chipping away at our community, it's a checkerboard which the federal government tried to address after 1990, and that because of that, there's certain areas where there are Quebecois living amongst us, and then there's Mohawks living in what's known as Oka, which is also Kanesatake. And so when the checkpoints went up to protect the community from, as I said, this free flow of people coming in who didn't want to stay home into our community, there was at first support from the Mayor of Oka, and then it's quickly changed to, well, we have to open up the economy, right? This whole mindless economy first before human rights and before safety and well-being. And so there was threats, like as I mentioned, it was problematic. Many of us feel very vulnerable in the community on a daily basis, but this sort of enhanced it, because when something happens, we are hesitant to call the Sortits Quebec because they're racist. Perhaps not all of them, but they're racist. And then on top of that, we live in a separatist province that has this preconceived notions that we are public enemy number 1, and that whatever kind of violence is besought upon us, we must deserve it. And so these people come in with impunity, whether it's the SQ officer spitting on a person at the checkpoint, or a doctor coming in and hitting one of the people at the checkpoints. And this being reported to who else? The SQ, who else do we have to report? It's very difficult to maintain security at checkpoints when the people at the checkpoints are not even allowed to ask for ID to say whether or not they're an actual resident and they can pass through the community. So it's neglect, it's a community being vilified, and we have racism surrounding us on a daily basis. On top of that, all the colonial rooted problems that has happened since forever, three centuries, but has been really, really made worse in the past 30 years since the siege.
Thanks, Ms. Gabriel. We're well over time. We'll go now for 6 minutes to Ms. Damoff. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Chair. I'm coming to you as well from Oakville in the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I want to thank all of the witnesses today for their testimony. I'm going to focus my questions on Elijah because I'd really like to talk about some of the things you mentioned in terms of post-secondary. First of all, congratulations to the Sheridan grads. That's incredibly exciting, and please pass on my congratulations. Elijah, you were talking about the supports for your Indigenous learners at Sheridan. I'm wondering, some of that is the regular funding they get. I'm wondering if any of you, if you're aware of any of your students being able to access funding through that $75.2 million, and if they were not, what the barriers were to them accessing that funding.
Funding was announced. Many of our students were already pretty much done at that point. So when that happens, a lot of our students were trying to get home. Some students could not get home, as I mentioned, so they're still living here in Oakville. So we did encourage a lot of our students to apply to the funding for the post-secondary support. And I think that's where the clarity isn't really there, because I know when I spoke to some of them, they didn't know that their band was supposed to be receiving money to support them while they're in school. So it's sort of like it's sort of like a broken telephone is how I see it when these announcements are made. And we're also expecting students who are probably 18, 19, 20, maybe 17 in some cases, where if they don't really know that's out there for them, then how are they supposed to find it? And I think communication is really key to that. A simplification of language is key, because if we're speaking these big government bureaucratic talk, nobody's going to really relate and understand what it's actually saying for them. So, and I think also too, there's also mistrust. So I know in some cases, some people don't trust the government, unfortunately. So then they're not going to access support that way either, where they would really trust the Indigenous Center if we had more information at a quicker time to say, here's what is out there for you. You should really consider applying to that. And I think that's where the regional offices come into play. I think there needs to be a stronger connection with regional offices and post-secondary institutions.
Connectivity you brought up, and when you and I spoke, Elijah, you were talking about the fact that Six Nations doesn't have reliable internet. So it's not just, you don't have to go to the north. Our colleague Mumlak is unable to join our meetings because of lack of internet in Baker Lake. But you don't have to go that far. You just go outside Hamilton, Ontario to Six Nations. So how critical is that connectivity for your students, especially as you're looking at September, where you may still be online? I don't know if Sheridan has made the final decision, but how critical is that connectivity for your students?
Oh, it's so critical. I would say that 98% of the reserve, Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve, doesn't have access to internet, proper internet anyway. If you do, it's usually about 3 megabytes per second or 5 megabytes per second. And it's a shame that this reserve is not in up north, or it's not somewhere far off. It's close to the town of Caledonia. It's close to Brantford. It's close to Simcoe County, London, Hamilton, and it doesn't have access to proper broadband internet services. So it's not that it's not impossible to bring it there. There's a lack of infrastructure that exists. So if we are requiring people to go to school in the fall still online, and so most of our students will be online as the fall, some programs won't be, but that's going to be a huge piece for students to access education supports. And in my other hat that I wear, I'm also a board of director member for our employment agency. I would say over 50% of our staff can't even work remotely because of where they live on the reserve. So they can't access the portals for employment supports for our community.
One of the pieces that I think I've certainly talked to my colleagues in the Liberal caucus is missing in all of this is youth voices. I'm just wondering what your thoughts on Indigenous youth-led funding being provided and having some of those voices that you deal with as the director at Sheridan being shared with the committee to know what they're looking for in terms of access to funding.
Oh, it's so critical, I think, because then that opens up another lens through which they're seeing it. They're seeing it through as a student of 2020. They're seeing it as an Indigenous learner possibly coming from a reserve. They're seeing it as a learner in an urban setting. So they're going to bring a different lens to that table. So I would say that voice is really critical and needed in terms of making sure that the program is effective in what it's aiming to do, which is trying to provide educational outcomes for students. So the program should be reflective of who it serves, not for us, not the other way around.
And you have students not just from the GTA, you have students from the far north, you have students from all over Canada, right?
Yes.
And I think that's my time, Chair.
It is. Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. And I'm going to switch to French. Madame Berube.
Okay. Madame Berube, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank the witness participating in this committee. I would also like to thank the technicians and the interpreters that are playing a key role in the committee. I'm on the traditional territory of the Algonquin, Anishinaabe, and the Cree of the Abitibi, Bay James, Nunavik EU. My question for Mr. Cardinal. I'm pleased that you're here today, Mr. Cardinal. Can you briefly talk about make a reference between the COVID-19 crisis and the rail crisis of the past few months? Yes, thank you. That's a great question. The railroad crisis showed us the difference of reconciling interest of economic development in traditional unceded territories. And that's what we see. Most of Quebec territory, as you know, is on unceded traditional native lands on which First Nations have rights and sometimes ancestral titles. It gives them a right to the territory itself, but the difference with the Wet'suwet'en people in BC is that most Quebec First Nations don't have any traditional government structure that can oppose the band councils. There are very few exceptions. There are elected chiefs. They manage the band councils under the Indian Act. And then they have the inherent right for self-determination recognized in the Canadian government and the International Declaration on the First Nations Rights. So this goes beyond the limits of the community. What we must remember from the preceding crisis is the need for governments to recognize government's authority for the First Nations, not only on the reserved territory as such, but on a much broader territory. Those are the unceded traditional territories. Thank you. Another question, Mr. Cardinal. Knowing that you're also a communication specialist, could you tell us what you think of the media coverage as far as the Native people are concerned in these crises? To answer your question, I'll go back to the example I raised about the Oka Pack. If you look at media coverage, you realize that the Mohawk Council had a lot of difficulty transmitting its message, explaining its position as being based on the need to protect the health of its members. A lot of articles, reports introduce the story as bringing back some of the territorial conflicts opposing Kanasatake and the Oka municipality. I see the same issues as I raised during my testimony in the Vienne Commission on the relationships between Indigenous communities and certain public services in Quebec, especially if you look at the media coverage of Natives, Indigenous people, and their role in journalism. I see three major categories of bias based on lack of knowledge, lack of understanding. First of all, not understanding the cultural difference. Some are more of an ideological nature, racism, and so on. And beyond some of these prejudices we can see in media coverage, you should add the difficulty of Native or Indigenous leaders to come before the media. There is a general indifference. It's very hard to correctly present Indigenous issues in the media, even if these are of a public interest. A few years ago, Richard Desjardins had a film on the First Nations called The Peuple Invisible, the Invisible People. He was talking about the Anishinaabe. So there is this invisible element of the Indigenous people that's still real present, and it causes a lot of problems. And the most important problem for me is the distorted image that the general population has when it comes to Indigenous people, because the media are transmitting or not transmitting certain types of messages. Mr. Chair, do I have any time left? So one last question, Mr. Cardinal. According to you, after the current COVID-19, economic recovery is one of the most important issues for governments. Is it also one of the priorities for Indigenous communities? Absolutely. The economic recovery is certainly a priority for First Nations, but there are some concerns. One of them is that we are not fully taking into account the interest of the Indigenous populations in the government's recovery plans. We see it in Bill C-61 in Quebec today. The head of the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec Labrador, Ghislain Picard, was before that commission, and he underlined, despite the urgent context, the government cannot get away from its commitments towards the First Nations. And he raised another concern. It's a major one for First Nations. It's the general protection of the environment, natural resources, and fauna. So the deconfinement and economic recovery should be seen as an opportunity for businesses and Indigenous communities. I must stress here a very interesting initiative from major indigenous organizations that decided to come together to assist the federal government to better meet the needs of indigenous people in economic development. They created a working group on the COVID-19 indigenous businesses, the task force. It's to provide a unique indigenous voice to the federal government during this crisis. The group is now creating a major database on indigenous businesses that should be used by federal governments. They also provide analysis on the prevalence and the impact of this crisis on populations and indigenous businesses to make sure that they have assistance equivalent to that offered to other groups. Unprecedented collaboration, and it's very important if we want to have a better representation of indigenous people in the economic recovery plan in Canada. Thank you.
Another 6-minute round. Ms. Gazan, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank all the guests so far for your excellent testimony, and I will come back to questions shortly. But before I do, I'd like to dispose of the motion that I gave last week. So I move, and I hope we don't waste too much time debating the following: that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee invite the Minister of Indigenous Services and the Minister of Crown Relations to provide testimony regarding the supplementary estimates A 2020 to 2021 no later than June 16, 2020.
Seeing no comments, are we ready to take the vote? If we are, it will be a recorded vote by the clerk. Ms. Demoff, you have your hand up.
Yes, Chair. I was just wondering if the member would also agree that the Minister for Northern, Minister Van Dal, also appear at that meeting. There are actually 3 ministers responsible for Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Yeah, yes, that's fine.
Friendly amendment? Fine. Go ahead with the call of the vote, please, the division.
Thank you. Before we proceed, I would like to inform the committee that the list of members eligible to vote are the following: Jamie Schmel, Gary Vidal, Arnold Viersen, Bob Zimmer, Sylvie Berube, Leah Gazan, Amy Baptiste, Pam Damoff, Marcus Pulowski, Adam Van Koeverden, and Lenore Zan. When your name is called, please allow for a 2 to 3 second delay before answering. Your video should now be turned on.
Je m'excuse, il n'y a pas de traduction.
No translation?
Il n'y a pas d'interprétation.
Again, before we proceed, I would like to inform the committee that the list of members eligible to vote are the following: Jamie Schmel, Gary Vidal, Arnold Viersen, Bob Zimmer, Sylvie Berube, Leah Gazan, Amy Baptiste, Pam Damoff, Marcus Pulowski, Adam Van Koeverden, Lenore Zan. When your name is called, please allow for a 2 to 3 second delay before answering. Your video should be turned on. When you are recognized, please state clearly and verbally if you are in favor or opposed to the vote. I will now proceed to the taking of the recorded division on the motion. Mr. Schmel.